Forest mysteries. The fog came in like a held breath, slow and patient, and by the time Elias noticed it, the world had already shrunk to the width of his boat. He cut the throttle and listened. The outboard motor idled rough, coughing every few seconds. Behind him, the river should have been visible, the bend with the dead pine, the shallow where the base held in summer. Now there was nothing, just white, flat and dense, swallowing sound before it could echo. He should have turned back at dusk. His wife would have told him that. 3 years gone, and he still heard her voice when he made stupid choices. Don't push it, Eli. The river doesn't forgive. But the fish had been running late, and the cabin was empty, and the thought of another night sitting alone with his hands idle had pushed him onto the water. Now he was paying for it. The motor coughed again, then died. Elias pulled the starter cord. Nothing. He checked the fuel line, still connected, but the bulb felt soft. He pumped it twice, pulled again. The engine turned over, sputtered, and went silent. The fog pressed in from all sides, thick enough to taste. He could smell the mud banks, which meant he was too close to shore. He reached for the oars. They were gone. His stomach dropped. He remembered now, the bump against something underwater, maybe a submerged log, 20 minutes ago. The boat had lurched, and he'd grabbed the gunwale to steady himself. The oars had been loose in the locks. He'd heard a splash, but told himself it was a fish. Stupid, he said aloud. The word hung in the air for a second, then vanished into the white. He tried the motor again. 3 pulls. 4. Nothing. The current was moving him, slowly, but he could feel the boat turning. Without oars, without the motor, he was just a piece of driftwood. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Hey, anyone on the river?" The fog swallowed it whole. No echo, no answer, just the soft lap of water against the hull. He waited. The cold was working into his hands now, the knuckles stiff. His jacket was wet from the earlier spray, and the damp was seeping through to his chest. He thought about his wife again. The last winter, how she'd shivered even under 3 blankets, how he'd sat in the chair beside her bed and pretended to read. He'd been afraid to touch her, afraid she'd feel his fear and give up faster. She'd given up anyway. The boat scraped against something. He looked down, branches reaching out of the fog. He was in a channel, too narrow to turn around. The current pushed him deeper between walls of willow and alder. This wasn't the main river. He'd taken a dead-end cut, miles from open water. He shouted again. This time his voice cracked. Then he heard it. A howl, long and low, from somewhere on the left bank. Not panicked, not aggressive, just steady, like a note held on a cello. He froze, listening. Wolves didn't come close to water this time of year. They stayed deep in the forest, away from people. A second howl answered from the right. He turned his head, trying to place them. The first was maybe 200 yards upstream. The second, a little farther, downstream. They were calling to each other, but the sound felt wrong, too measured, too patient, like they were waiting for something. Or someone. The boat scraped again, harder this time. A branch caught the transom and held. The current pressed the hull against a tangle of deadfall, and the motor's prop snagged on a submerged limb. The boat tipped, listing to port. Water sloshed over the side. Elias made a choice. He grabbed his tackle box, the only thing worth saving, and slid over the gunwale into the river. The cold hit like a door slamming. His legs went numb instantly. He kicked toward the left bank, toward the first howl, clutching the tackle box with one hand. The current tried to pull him under the deadfall, but he grabbed a branch and pulled himself forward. Mud sucked at his boots. He crawled onto the bank, gasping, his lungs burning. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving. The howls had stopped. The fog was thinner here, close to the trees, and he could see a gap in the alders, a path, maybe, or an animal trail. He pushed himself up and walked toward it. The howl came again, closer now. He followed it. The path opened into a clearing. And in the clearing, there were lights. Lanterns, hanging from poles, leading toward a cluster of dark buildings. A village. He'd fished this river for 20 years, and he'd never seen a village here. At the edge of the forest, the wolves fell silent. He stepped forward, mud sucking at his boots, and saw the first door. On it, fresh scratches. For lines, parallel, deep enough to splinter the wood. The scratches on the door were fresh. Elias ran his fingers over them. For lines, parallel, deep enough to catch his thumbnail. The wood underneath was pale, not yet grayed by weather. Made today? Maybe an hour ago. He stepped back and looked at the other doors lining the muddy path. Every one of them had the same marks. For lines. Claw marks, he thought. But the spacing was wrong for a wolf or bear. Too even. Too deliberate. Like fingers. His clothes were soaked through, and the cold had settled into his bones. He was shivering now, the kind of shivering that came from the inside out, and he knew if he didn't find shelter soon, he'd be in real trouble. Hypothermia didn't care about mysteries. It just took you while you weren't paying attention. He tried the door. It swung open without a sound. Inside, a lamp burned on a wooden table. A kerosene lamp, trimmed low, the wick smoking a little. The table was set for one, a bowl of stew, a slice of dark bread, a tin cup half full of water. The stew was still warm. He could smell the meat, the potatoes, the thin film of fat on top. His stomach cramped hard enough to make him double over. He told himself not to touch it, told himself this was wrong. All of it. A village that shouldn't exist with food that was still hot and lamps that were still burning and no people anywhere. But the cold was eating through him, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely stand. He sat down and ate. The stew was good. Too good. The meat was tender, the broth rich with herbs he couldn't name. He ate fast, barely tasting, and when the bowl was empty, he drank the water in 3 swallows. The warmth spread through his chest, and the shivering eased. He sat there for a moment with his eyes closed, listening to the lamp hiss. The house was small but cared for. Wood stove with a fire banked low. Windows clean. A quilt folded over the back of a chair, the patches worn soft. Someone lived here. Someone had been here today. But there were no sounds from outside, no voices, no footsteps. Just the fog pressing against the windows and the slow drip of water from the eaves. He looked at the walls and saw the drawing. It was on the far wall, above the stove, drawn with charcoal on a piece of bark. Stick figures. 6 of them, maybe 7, standing in a row. They had long arms that reached down past their knees and faces that were just circles with dots for eyes. But the mouths were wrong. The mouths were lines, straight across, not smiling or frowning, just mouths. And beside the figures, something that might have been a wolf or a dog, too big to fit on the bark, its legs running off the edge. He stood up and walked to the window. The path outside was empty. The lanterns flickered on their poles, but there was no wind to move them. He watched them for a long minute, trying to see the pattern, trying to find the explanation that would make this ordinary. There was no explanation. He left the house and walked toward the center of the village. The buildings were arranged in a rough circle around a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing stood a church. Not a real church, too small for that, but a meeting house with a cross nailed over the door. Light came through the windows. Yellow light, warm, moving slightly like candle flames. He pushed the door open. The pews were full. 50 people, maybe more, kneeling with their heads tilted back and their throats exposed. Their eyes were open. They were staring at the ceiling, where someone had painted a sky full of stars, but the paint was old and the stars were flaking off. The only sound was breathing. 50 people breathing together, in and out, slow as a tide. Elias took a step back, and the floor creaked under his weight. 50 heads turned toward him. They didn't move fast. They moved like people waking from a deep sleep, slow and heavy, their eyes finding him one by one. He saw their faces, old, young, men, women, children, and they all had the same expression. Not surprise, not fear, something that looked like recognition, like they'd been waiting for him. A woman rose from the front pew. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back and a face that might have been pretty before something wore it thin. She walked toward him, and the other people parted for her without looking at her. They kept their eyes on Elias. She stopped 3 feet away and smiled. Her teeth were small and even, and her smile was kind, and that kindness was worse than anything else he'd seen tonight. "You came," she said. Her voice was ordinary, a woman's voice, worn at the edges. "The wolves told us. They always bring us the ones who are ready." He looked past her, at the people in the pews. They were still watching him, still breathing together. A child near the front, a girl, maybe 8, had her hand on her mother's arm, and her mother's arm was covered in scratches, old ones, healed over but still visible in the lamplight. "Ready for what?" he said. The woman's smile didn't change. "To stop fighting." The woman took him by the arm and led him to the long table at the front of the church. Her grip was light, but he followed without thinking. His legs moved because moving was easier than stopping. The other villagers had settled back into their pews, but their eyes stayed on him, 50 pairs of them, watching with the same patient stillness. She sat him down at the head of the table. A man appeared with dry clothes, wool pants, a thick flannel shirt, socks that had been mended twice, and Elias put them on without asking where they came from. His own clothes were hung near the wood stove, and the warmth of the room was already pulling the cold from his bones. Then the food came. A girl brought bread, dark and dense, still warm from the oven. Another poured vodka into a small glass, the liquid clear as water. A third set down a plate of roasted meat, potatoes slick with butter, a pickled beet salad that smelled of vinegar and dill. The table filled until the wood groaned under the weight. Elias looked at the food, then at the villagers. None of them sat. None of them ate. They stood in a loose circle around the table, watching. "Eat," the woman said. She sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder almost touched his. "You're cold. You're hungry. That's all this is." He picked up the bread and bit into it. The flavor was sweet, wrong for bread, a cloying sugar that made his teeth ache. He almost spat it out, but his stomach clenched with hunger, and he chewed and swallowed. The vodka followed, burning down his throat and spreading through his chest like a second fire. She refilled his glass. "What's your name?" "Elias." "Elias," she repeated, tasting the word. "And where are you from, Elias?" "Down river. Cabin, maybe 20 miles. I fish." "You fish?" She smiled again, that same kind smile. "And who do you fish for?" He took another drink. "Myself." "Alone?" The question hung in the air. He looked at the table, at the steam rising from the meat, at his hands still shaking slightly from the cold. 3 years of mornings alone. 3 years of coffee for one, dinner for one. The radio turned off because nobody was there to listen. 3 years of talking to her photograph until her face blurred in the lamplight, and he had to stop because his throat closed up. "Yes," he said, "alone." The woman nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. She reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were cold. Not cold from the weather, but cold the way stone was cold, or water from a deep well. "We were all alone," she said. "That's why the wolves brought us here." He looked at the circle of faces. The old man with the scarred hands, the young couple standing shoulder to shoulder, the girl who'd brought the bread. They were all watching him with the same expression, not hunger, not threat, but something closer to hope, like he was the answer to a question they'd been asking for a very long time. "The wolves brought you," he said. "Every year, someone finds us. Or we find them. It depends on how you look at it." She poured more vodka into his glass, though he hadn't finished the last. "The wolves know who's ready. They can smell it. the grief, the weariness, the part of you that's tired of carrying. He wanted to pull his hand away, but he didn't. Her cold fingers felt almost natural now, like the cold of the river had become part of him and she was just another piece of it. Ready for what? He asked again. She leaned closer. He could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the way her pupils were too large in the lamplight. To stay? We don't force anyone. We don't trick anyone. Every year, one person chooses. And in exchange, the wolves take care of us. The winter doesn't bite so hard. The game comes when we need it. The hunger never reaches us. He looked at the villagers. Their faces were not thin. Their clothes were worn but whole. They looked like people who had enough. And what do the wolves get? He said. The woman's smile widened. What you give them. Your name. All the names you ever carried. The grief. The memories. The weight you've been dragging behind you like a deadfall. You give it to them, and they give you peace. The bread on his plate seemed darker now, the meat glistening. He thought of his cabin, the photograph on the mantel, the watch his father had given him that he wound every morning even though it ran fast. He thought of the last time he'd seen his wife alive, her hand reaching for him, his refusal to take it because he was too afraid to say goodbye. Elias. The woman's voice was soft. You don't have to carry it anymore. She held out her hand, palm up, waiting. His hand moved toward hers before he knew what he was doing. The warmth of the room, the food in his belly, the vodka humming in his blood. It was all pulling him toward her like a current. He wanted to stop. He wanted to take her hand. The two things existed in him at the same time, neither stronger than the other. And then he heard his wife's voice. Not the voice from the photograph, worn smooth by memory. The real voice, the one from the last week, when her body had already started shutting down and her mind was still sharp. She'd grabbed his wrist, her fingers thin as wire, and pulled him close enough to smell the sickness on her breath. Don't let them make you forget who you are. He hadn't understood then. He'd thought she was talking about the doctors, the nurses, the people who kept offering morphine in quiet rooms. But now, with the woman's cold hand inches from his, he understood. He pulled back. The woman's smile flickered, just for a second. Then it returned, as steady as before. It's all right, she said. You don't have to decide now. But something in her eyes had changed. The kindness was still there, but underneath it, Elias saw something else. Patience, maybe, or certainty. The certainty of someone who knew, without any doubt, that he would take her hand before the night was over. The warmth drained from the church the moment Elias pulled his hand back, not the heat from the stove that still radiated against his legs, but something else, something that had been wrapped around him since he sat down at the table. It lifted like a blanket pulled away in winter, leaving him exposed and suddenly aware of how close he'd come to taking her hand. The woman stood. The other villagers didn't move, but the space around Elias felt larger now, emptier. The girl who'd brought the bread was gone. The old man with the scarred hands had retreated to the shadows near the door. Only the woman remained close, her cold presence still pressing against his side. You don't want to stay, she said. It wasn't a question. He shook his head. His mouth was dry despite the vodka. Then you'll have to meet them. She walked toward the church doors without looking back to see if he followed. The villagers parted for her, then closed behind her, and Elias understood that he had no choice. The path she'd opened would close if he didn't move. He followed her into the night. The fog had thinned at the edge of the forest. The lanterns still burned along the path, but their light seemed smaller now, swallowed by the dark between the trees. The woman walked ahead of him, her boots silent on the packed mud. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The way was marked by something Elias couldn't see but could feel, a pressure in the air, a weight that grew heavier with each step. They stopped at a clearing. 3 wolves waited there. Elias had seen wolves before, from a distance, their gray shapes slipping between trees or frozen on a ridge line watching him pass. These were different. They were larger than any wolves he'd seen, their shoulders level with his hips, their coats so dark they seemed to absorb the lantern light instead of reflecting it. The one in the center was gray, almost white in places, with eyes the color of old honey. It sat on its haunches and watched him with a stillness that didn't belong to any animal he knew. The woman stopped at the clearing's edge. "They don't hurt anyone who doesn't want to be hurt," she said. "But they need to see you, to know what you are." He wanted to run. His legs were heavy, his chest tight, every instinct screaming at him to turn back toward the river. But his feet stayed planted, not because he was brave, because the wolf's eyes held him in place the way the current had held his boat, moving him without his consent, pulling him toward something he couldn't name. The gray wolf stood and walked toward him. Elias heard the woman's breath catch behind him. He heard the other two wolves whine softly, a sound like grief or hunger. But the gray wolf made no sound at all. It crossed the clearing in 3 strides and stopped a foot away, close enough for him to smell the pine and blood on its fur, close enough to see the steam rising from its muzzle in the cold air. It pressed its nose against his chest. The touch was gentle, almost tender, but the pressure that followed was not physical. It was something inside him, something that opened like a door he'd kept locked for years. He saw his wife's face, not as he remembered her from the photograph, but as she'd been at the end. The hollow cheeks, the yellowed skin, the way her hand had fallen back to the bed when he didn't take it. He saw his father's watch on his wrist, the hands moving backward, the memory of the old man's last breath rattling in a room that smelled of urine and neglect. He saw the nights he'd sat in his cabin with a bottle and her photograph, telling himself he was mourning when he was really hiding. The wolf made a sound, not a growl or a whine, but something lower, something that vibrated in his chest and behind his eyes. It sounded almost like a word, almost like his name. He tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't move. The wolf's nose was still pressed against his chest, and he could feel it now. Not just pressure, but warmth, spreading through his ribs like water seeping through cracks in a dam. The warmth reached his throat and his eyes, and the place behind his sternum where he'd been carrying something so long he'd forgotten it was there. "They can smell it," the woman said. Her voice came from very far away. "The grief, the loneliness, the part of you that wants to let go." The wolf pulled back and looked at him. Its eyes held his, and in them he saw something that made his breath stop. A reflection, not his own face, but hers. His wife's face, younger than she'd been at the end, healthy and whole, her hand reaching toward him the way it had reached in the hospital. But this time, her fingers weren't thin. This time, she was smiling. The wolf's mouth opened, and a sound came out. Not a howl, not a whine. A voice, low and rough, shaped around teeth that weren't made for human words, but tried anyway. "Stay." Elias staggered back. The warmth vanished. The wolf's eyes went flat and amber again, and the face he'd seen in them was gone. He was in the clearing with the woman and the wolves, the cold biting through the borrowed clothes, his breath coming in short gasps that clouded the air. The gray wolf turned and walked back to the others. They sat together in a line, watching him, and in the lantern light their shadows stretched across the clearing like 3 roads leading into the forest. The woman touched his arm. Her fingers were warm now, almost human. "They don't force," she said, "but they offer. And the offer doesn't go away until you leave, or until you take it." She led him back toward the village, and he followed because he couldn't think of anywhere else to go. Behind him, the wolves didn't move, but he could feel their eyes on his back, patient and waiting, and somewhere in the dark between the trees, a voice that wasn't quite a voice whispered his name again. They gave him a cabin at the edge of the village, not the one he'd first entered, but something smaller, set back from the path where the lanterns barely reached. The woman opened the door and stepped aside, and when Elias walked in, he stopped breathing. His cabin. Not just a cabin like his cabin. The same wood stove with the rust patch on the side. The same cot against the wall with the gray wool blanket his wife had knitted. The same shelf above the window holding the same jars of nails and fishing flies, and the same photograph in the same frame. He walked toward the photograph. His wife's face looked back at him, the same as it had for 3 years. But the frame was wrong. The wood was warped, curved inward at the edges like something had pressed against it from behind. He touched it, and the glass was warm. "We brought your things," the woman said from the doorway. "The wolves found them. They're good at finding things people leave behind." He turned to the mantel. His father's watch lay there on the wood, the leather band worn smooth where the old man's wrist had been. He picked it up and held it to his ear. The ticking was wrong. It was moving backward. The second hand swept counterclockwise, smooth as water running uphill, and the numbers on the face seemed to blur when he looked at them too long. "It's yours," she said. "All of it. Nothing's been taken. Nothing's been changed." He set the watch down. The second hand kept moving backward. He looked around the cabin again, looking for the thing that would make this ordinary. The fire was lit in the stove. The kettle was on the hook. A cup sat on the table, half full of tea that was still warm. It was his cabin, exactly as he'd left it this morning. But the wood was too soft under his feet. The walls were too close. The window showed the forest, but when he blinked, the trees moved. "Rest," the woman said. "Tomorrow, if you still want to leave, we'll show you the way." She closed the door behind her. He heard her footsteps fade down the path, and then there was nothing but the fire and the watch ticking backward and the photograph of his wife in the warped frame. He sat on the cot and put his head in his hands. The cabin smelled like his cabin, pine and wood smoke and the faint salt of dried fish. But underneath it was something else, something sweet like rot, like fruit left too long in the sun. He'd noticed it in the church too, under the food and the vodka and the warmth. The village smelled like that, like things that should have decayed but hadn't. He looked at the photograph again. His wife's face had changed. Her smile was wider now, the corners of her mouth pulled back too far, showing teeth he didn't remember. He blinked, and it was her smile again, the real one, the one she'd worn when he brought her coffee in the morning. But the frame was still warped, and the glass was still warm. He stood up and paced the cabin, for steps to the stove, for steps back. The walls pressed closer with each pass, and the ceiling seemed lower than it had been when he walked in. He stopped at the window and pressed his forehead against the glass. Outside, the lanterns flickered without wind, and between them, he saw shapes moving. Not people, not wolves. Shapes that were both and neither, passing through the light like smoke through a screen. He closed his eyes and tried to remember his wife's face. The real one, the one that wasn't in the photograph. He saw her in the hospital bed, her hair thin against the pillow. Saw her hand reaching for him, her fingers curling when he didn't take it. Saw her mouth open to say something, the word catching in her throat because there wasn't enough air left to push it out. He'd sat beside her for 3 hours after she stopped breathing, waiting for her to say it, waiting for her to forgive him. The watch ticked backward on the mantel. The second hand swept counterclockwise, pulling time the wrong direction, pulling him back towards something he'd spent 3 years trying to outrun. He opened his eyes. The shapes were gone from the path, but the photograph was different again. His wife's face had closed. Her eyes were shut, her mouth a thin line, and he knew without touching it that the glass would be cold now. He left the cabin and walked toward the church. He needed to see the people again. Needed to see faces that moved and breathed and didn't change when he looked away. The church was empty. The pews were empty. The long table cleared. The candles burned down to wax pools on the floor. But the door at the back, the one behind the altar, was open. He'd missed it before, tucked behind a hanging cloth, but now it stood wide, and a draft came through it that smelled of earth and honey. He walked through the door and found the pit. It was behind the church, a depression in the ground maybe 10 feet across, lined with stones that had been set there a long time ago. Lanterns hung on poles around its edge, and in their light, Elias saw what filled the hole. Bones. Human bones, stacked in spirals that wound inward toward the center. Ribs and femurs and skulls with empty sockets, arranged with a care that made his stomach turn. And scattered among them, personal things. Watches, rings, a child's shoe, a wedding band on a finger bone, the gold still gleaming. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. The woman stood at the church door, her face lit from below by the lanterns, and for the first time, she looked old. "We were all like you," she said. "Alone, grieving. The wolves gave us a way to stop hurting." He looked at the pit, at the bones, the watches, the rings. "But stopping hurting," she said, "means stopping being." She walked toward him, and he stepped back, but the pit was behind him now, and there was nowhere else to go. "You can still leave," she said, "but you have to go now, before morning, before you forget why you wanted to." Elias ran. He didn't think about it. His legs moved before his mind caught up, carrying him away from the pit, away from the woman, away from the church and the cabins and the lanterns that flickered without wind. He ran down the path toward the river, his breath tearing out of his chest, the borrowed clothes too big and too loose and slowing him down. Behind him, he heard nothing. No footsteps, no shouts, no howls. Just the silence of the village, watching him go. The path twisted through the trees, and he followed it because there was no other direction. The lantern stopped at the edge of the village, and after that, there was only darkness and the faint gleam of frost on branches. He ran until his legs burned and his lungs screamed, and then he ran further, because stopping meant turning around, and turning around meant the woman's cold hand and the wolf's warm nose and the photograph of his wife with the smile that wasn't hers. He stumbled into a clearing and fell to his knees. The river was ahead of him. He could hear it, the slow current pushing against the banks, the sound he'd known since he was old enough to walk. He crawled toward it, his hands scraping on roots and stones, and when he reached the bank, he saw the boat. His boat. The same aluminum hull, the same rusted oarlocks, the same old motor that had died in the fog. It was tied to a willow branch, floating steady, the oars laid across the seats exactly where he'd left them before everything went wrong. The tackle box was there too, the one he'd grabbed when he went into the water, still closed, still dry. He stood up and reached for the bow line. The wolf stepped out of the trees. It was the gray one, the one that had pressed its nose against his chest. It sat between him and the boat, its amber eyes fixed on his face, and it didn't move. It didn't growl or bare its teeth. It just sat there, patient, the way a dog sat by a door when it wanted to go inside. Elias's hand closed on the line, but he didn't pull it loose. The woman's voice came from the darkness behind him, not loud, but clear, as if she were standing right beside him. "Take the boat, and you take your grief back. Every day of it. Every night you woke up and wished you died instead of her. Are you ready for that, fisherman?" He turned. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, alone, her hands folded in front of her. The other villagers weren't with her. The wolves weren't with her. Just her, and the dark trees behind her, and the silence that seemed to press against his ears like water. "What are you?" he said. His voice cracked. "I was a teacher," she said, "in a town about 50 miles from here. I had a husband, a daughter. They died in a fire while I was at work. I came here because I couldn't stay there, and I couldn't go back, and the wolves found me walking in the snow with no coat and no shoes." She paused. "That was 30 years ago. I haven't aged a day since. But I haven't lived one either." He looked at the boat. The oars were there. The motor would start now. He knew it would, just like he knew the wolves wouldn't stop him if he got in and pushed off. He could be back at his cabin by morning. Back to the photograph, the watch, the empty chair. back to the silence that had been eating him for 3 years. He looked at the wolf. It hadn't moved. Its eyes held his, and in them he saw something that wasn't threat or hunger. It was waiting, not for him to choose the village or the river, for him to choose something else entirely. I don't know how, he said. The woman took a step closer. How to what? To let go. He pulled the boat line free, but he didn't get in. He held it in his hands, the rope rough against his palms, and he felt the path twisted through the trees, and he followed it because there was no other direction. The lantern stopped at the edge of the village, and after that, there was only darkness and the faint gleam of frost on branches. He ran until his legs burned and his lungs screamed, and then he ran further, because stopping meant turning around, and turning around meant the woman's cold hand and the wolf's warm nose and the photograph of his wife with the smile that wasn't hers. He stumbled into a clearing and fell to his knees. The river was ahead of him. He could hear it, the slow current pushing against the banks, the sound he'd known since he was old enough to walk. He crawled toward it, his hands scraping on roots and stones, and when he reached the bank, he saw the boat. His boat, the same aluminum hull, the same rusted oarlocks, the same old motor that had died in the fog. It was tied to a willow branch, floating steady, the oars laid across the seats exactly where he'd left them before everything went wrong. The tackle box was there too, the one he'd grabbed when he went into the water, still closed, still dry. He stood up and reached for the bow line. The wolf stepped out of the trees. It was the gray one, the one that had pressed its nose against his chest. It sat between him and the boat, its amber eyes fixed on his face, and it didn't move. It didn't growl. He let go of the rope. The boat drifted away from the bank, turning slowly in the current. The oars stayed in place, the motor still, and for a moment it looked like it might hold there, caught in the eddy. Then the current caught it and pulled it downstream, toward the main channel, toward the cabin and the photograph and everything he'd been running from for 3 years. He watched it go. The wolf didn't move. The woman didn't move. The boat drifted into the fog and disappeared, and Elias stood on the bank with nothing left to carry and nothing left to hold. I don't know what comes next, he said. That's the point, the woman said. You're not supposed to know. She walked toward him, and this time, when she reached for his hand, he took it. Her fingers were warm now, almost human. The wolf howled once, low and long, and the sound didn't feel like a summons anymore. It felt like a door closing, or maybe opening. Elias couldn't tell the difference anymore, and for the first time in 3 years, that didn't feel like failure. He didn't go back to the cabin. The woman led him through the village, past the dark windows and the empty doors, past the church with its cross and its pit of bones, and stopped at the edge of the forest where the lanterns ended and the trees began. The wolf had disappeared somewhere in the dark, but Elias could still feel it, the warmth of its body against his leg, the weight of its presence pressing against his thoughts. You don't have to do this tonight, the woman said. Yes, I do. He looked at the trees. The path that led to the clearing was barely visible, just a break in the undergrowth where the frost lay thinner on the ground. I need to see them again. Without you. She studied his face for a long moment. Her eyes were human now, not the flat emptiness he'd seen in the church, and he wondered how long it had been since anyone had asked her to step aside, to let them face the wolves alone. They won't hurt you, but they won't give you what you want, either. Not if you're asking for the wrong thing. I don't know what I'm asking for. Then you're not ready. He walked past her into the trees. The path was narrow, the branches catching at his sleeves, and the darkness was so thick he had to feel his way forward with his hands. Behind him, he heard her footsteps retreating toward the village, and then there was nothing but the cold and the silence and the slow rhythm of his own breathing. The clearing was empty when he reached it. The 3 wolves were gone, but the ground was pressed flat where they'd been sitting, and the smell of pine and blood still hung in the air. He stood in the center of the clearing and waited. He didn't know how long he stood there. Long enough for the cold to work through the borrowed clothes. Long enough for his hands to go numb. Long enough for the fog to drift back in and wrap itself around the trees. He thought about calling out, but there was no one to call to. The wolves would come or they wouldn't. He couldn't force it. He sat down on the frozen ground and closed his eyes. His wife's face came to him unbidden. Not the face from the photograph, warped and smiling. The real face. The one he'd seen every morning for 15 years. The one that had looked at him across the breakfast table with the same tired affection. The one that had grayed and thinned and hollowed as the sickness took her. He let it come. He didn't push it away. He remembered the last week. The way her fingers had curled around the bedsheet when the pain got bad. The way she'd asked for iced chips even though she couldn't swallow anymore. The way she'd looked at him on the last morning, her eyes clear for the first time in days, and said his name. Just his name. Like she was testing it, tasting it, making sure she remembered it right. He remembered sitting in the chair beside her bed, the book open on his lap, not reading, just waiting. Waiting for her to say something that would make it easier. Waiting for her to forgive him for being afraid. Waiting for her to tell him it was all right to let go. She'd reached for him. He'd seen her hand lift off the sheet, seen her fingers stretch toward his arm, and he'd sat there with his heart pounding and his throat closed and done nothing. He'd watched her hand fall back to the bed. He'd watched her eyes close. And he'd sat there for 3 hours afterward, still waiting, still hoping she'd open her eyes and tell him it wasn't too late. The wolf came out of the fog without sound. One moment the clearing was empty, and the next the gray wolf was sitting in front of him, close enough to touch. Its eyes were amber and patient, and its fur was silver in the faint light, and Elias looked at it and saw something he hadn't seen the first time. Not a reflection, not his wife's face. Something older, something that had been watching people make choices for a very long time. "I'm not ready to let go," he said. His voice was hoarse, raw from the cold and the running and the words he'd finally said at the river. "But I'm ready to stop pretending I can hold on." The wolf didn't move, didn't speak, but the clearing changed. The fog lifted, and the trees pulled back, and the sky opened above them, full of stars he'd never seen before, constellations that didn't exist in any sky he knew. The ground beneath him was warm, and the cold left his hands, and for a moment, just a moment, he wasn't in the clearing anymore. He was in the hospital room, sitting in the chair beside his wife's bed, and her hand was reaching for him again. This time he took it. Her fingers were warm. Her skin was whole. She looked at him with eyes that weren't clouded by pain or morphine, and she smiled. And it was her smile, the real one, the one she'd worn when he brought her coffee in the morning or when they sat on the porch in the evening watching the river. "It wasn't your fault," she said. He opened his mouth to answer, but the hospital room was gone, and the clearing was gone, and he was sitting on the frozen ground with the wolf beside him and the stars wheeling overhead, and something in his chest that had been tight for 3 years had loosened. Not gone, just loosened, like a knot that had finally started to give. The wolf stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. It paused there, looking back at him, and in its eyes he saw the hospital room again, his wife's hand in his, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been at the end. "I'm sorry," he said, to the wolf, to his wife, to himself. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I made your death about me." The wolf turned and disappeared into the trees. The clearing was empty again, but the ground was warm where he sat, and the stars above him were the stars he'd known his whole life, the same ones that had hung over the river since he was a boy. He sat there until dawn, and when the sun rose, he walked back to the village. The woman was waiting at the edge of the forest, her face softer than he'd seen it, and she didn't ask him what had happened. She just nodded once and stepped aside, and he walked past her toward the river, toward whatever came next. The village was gone when he turned back from the river. Not empty, not waiting, gone. The cabins had folded into the trees like they'd never been there. The path was a game trail, overgrown with bramble and bracken. The church, the lanterns, the woman with her warm hands and older eyes. All of it had pulled back into the forest while he slept, leaving him standing on the bank with nothing but the clothes on his back and the frost on the ground. He should have felt afraid. Instead, he felt light. Hollowed out, maybe, but not empty. Like a room after a storm, the windows thrown open, the air moving through it for the first time in years. He sat down on a fallen log at the river's edge. The sun was up now, thin and pale behind a layer of clouds, and the water moved past him in the same slow current he'd known since childhood. His boat was gone, carried downstream sometime in the night, but that didn't matter. He wasn't going back to the cabin. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He took off the borrowed clothes and laid them on the log. The wool shirt, the mended socks, the pants that had belonged to someone who'd come here before him and chosen something else. He folded them carefully, the way his mother had taught him, and left them there for whoever might need them next. The cold bit at his skin, but he didn't put his old clothes back on. They were still wet from the river, stiff with mud, and the thought of wearing them felt like stepping back into something he'd just climbed out of. He stood naked at the edge of the water, shivering, and for a long moment, he didn't move. He thought about the woman's words, "You're not supposed to know." She'd been here 30 years, frozen in a single moment, trading her grief for her life. He'd almost done the same. He'd been ready to let the wolves take his name, his memories, the weight he'd been dragging behind him, because carrying it had become too heavy. But the wolves hadn't wanted his grief. They'd wanted him to see it, to name it, to let it be what it was instead of pretending it was something else. He stepped into the river. The cold drove the breath out of him. His legs went numb immediately, and his chest seized, and for a moment he thought he'd made a terrible mistake. But he kept walking, deeper, until the water was at his waist, his chest, his shoulders. He stopped there, with the current pushing against him, and he let himself feel it. The cold, the loss, the 3 years of silence that had followed him from the hospital to the cabin to this place. He thought of his wife's hand, the last time he'd held it. Not the moment in the hospital when he'd let it fall. The morning before, when she'd still been strong enough to squeeze back. She'd looked at him across the breakfast table, the sun coming through the window, and she'd said, "What are you thinking about?" He'd said, "Nothing." She'd smiled. Liar. He'd been thinking about the river, about the way the light hit the water in the evenings, gold and red, the way they'd sit on the porch and watch it until the mosquitoes drove them inside. He'd been thinking that he didn't want it to end, that he'd do anything to keep it going, even if it meant sitting beside her bed for another year, another decade, pretending to read while she faded away. He hadn't said any of that. He'd said nothing, and she'd let him, because she'd always let him, even when he gave her nothing to work with. The water moved around him, and he stood in it until his lips went blue and his hands stopped shaking because they were too cold to shake anymore. Then he walked back to the bank, slow and careful, and he put on his old clothes. The wet fabric clung to his skin, but it was his. The smell of the river, the mud, the fish, it was the smell of his life, the one he'd been living alone for 3 years, the one he'd been hiding in. He sat on the log and looked at the trail that led back into the forest. Somewhere in those trees, the wolves were watching. The woman was gone, the village was gone, but the wolves were still there. They'd always be there, he realized, not waiting for him to come back. Just there, like the river was there, like the cold was there, like the grief was there. He picked up a stone from the bank and held it in his palm. It was smooth, river-worn, gray as the wolf's fur. He thought about the things he'd been carrying, the guilt, the shame, the story he'd been telling himself about the kind of man he was. He'd built it stone by stone, a cairn to mark the place where he'd buried himself alive. He threw the stone into the river. It disappeared with a soft splash, and the current took it, and he watched it go. He threw another, and another, each one a word he'd never said, a choice he'd never made, a night he'd sat alone with the photograph instead of calling someone, anyone, to tell them he was drowning. He threw them until his arm ached, until the pile beside him was gone, until his hands were empty. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, full of water and trees and the faint cry of a bird somewhere downstream, full of the breath in his lungs and the blood moving back into his fingers and the slow, steady beat of his heart, full of everything he'd been too afraid to feel for 3 years. He sat there until the sun was high, until the frost melted off the grass, until the cold in his bones finally gave way to something that might have been warmth. Then he stood up and looked at the river. The boat was gone. The village was gone. The wolves had pulled back into the forest, and the woman was somewhere in the trees, frozen in her 30-year stillness, waiting for someone else who needed to stop fighting. He started walking, not toward the cabin, not toward the town he'd never let himself see, but along the riverbank, following the current downstream. He didn't know where it would take him. He didn't know what he'd find when he got there. But for the first time in 3 years, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like a door opening, and for once, he was ready to walk through it. He'd gone maybe 100 yards when he found the fir. A single tuft of gray, caught on a branch at the water's edge, soft as a whisper. He picked it up and tucked it into his pocket, close to his chest, and he kept walking. The sun had climbed higher by the time he found the bend with the dead pine. He knew it before he saw it. The way the current slowed, the smell of the mud flats, the particular angle of light through the branches. He'd passed this bend 1,000 times, maybe more, and he'd never stopped to look at it. It was just a marker, a place where the river turned and the fishing got better half a mile downstream. Now he stopped and looked. The dead pine leaned out over the water, its branches stripped of needles, its bark flaking away in long strips. A heron was standing on a snag near the opposite bank, motionless, its head tucked into its shoulders. The fog had burned off completely, and the river was blue, the color of deep water in late autumn, and the sky above it was the same color, so that the horizon had disappeared and the world was just water and light. He'd forgotten how beautiful it was. No, that wasn't right. He'd stopped seeing it. Somewhere in the 3 years since his wife died, he'd stopped looking at the river and started just moving across it, from the cabin to the fishing grounds and back, the way a machine moves through its motions without noticing anything beyond the next task. He sat down on the bank and watched the heron. It was patient, more patient than he'd ever been, standing in the cold water with its eyes fixed on something beneath the surface. He'd fished for years without learning that kind of patience. He'd fished to fill time, to empty his mind, to exhaust his body so he could sleep without dreaming. He'd never fished just to be on the river. The heron struck. Its head moved faster than he could track, and when it lifted from the water, a fish was in its beak, silver and thrashing. The heron tossed it once, twice, and swallowed it whole, and then it went back to standing, motionless, waiting for the next one. Elias stood up and kept walking. The river curved again, and the forest opened into a stretch of marsh he'd known since he was a boy. His father had brought him here to hunt ducks, back when the marsh was bigger and the birds came through in clouds. The marsh was smaller now, the channels silted in, but the reeds still grew tall, and the water was still dark with peat. He walked along the edge, his boots sinking into the mud, and he remembered his father's hand on his shoulder, pointing at a flock of teal coming in low over the water. "Wait," his father would say. "Let them come to you." He'd never been good at waiting. He'd been good at moving, at doing, at filling every hour with something that looked like purpose. When his wife got sick, he'd filled the hours with doctors and treatments and research, because doing something felt better than sitting beside her bed and waiting for what came next. And when she died, he'd filled the years with fishing and solitude and silence, because sitting in the cabin felt better than going out and finding something new. He stopped at the edge of the marsh and looked back the way he'd come. The forest was still there, the trees dark against the sky, and somewhere in those trees, the wolves were watching. He could feel them, not as a presence or a threat, but as a weight that had lifted. They'd done what they came to do. They'd shown him what he was carrying. They'd let him put it down. He walked on. The river widened as he went, the banks flattening, the current slowing. He passed the mouth of the channel where he'd gone in last night. He could see the deadfall where his boat had snagged, the alders where he'd crawled out of the water. It looked ordinary in the daylight. Just a creek mouth, overgrown, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Easy to drift into if you'd stopped paying attention a long time ago. He thought about the woman, not her face or her words, but the thing behind them. The 30 years she'd spent frozen in the same moment, waiting for someone else to make the choice she hadn't been able to make. He thought about the wolves, and the bones in the pit, and the villagers with their patient eyes and their warm food and their cold hands. They'd all been where he was. They'd all been carrying something they couldn't put down, and they'd found a way to stop carrying it, but the way had cost them something he hadn't been willing to pay. He touched his pocket. The tuft of fur was still there, soft against his fingers. He was thinking about his wife when he rounded the next bend. Not the woman in the photograph, not the ghost he'd been talking to for 3 years. The real woman, the one who'd burned the toast and laughed about it. The one who'd stood beside him at his father's funeral, her hand in his, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. The one who'd looked at him across the breakfast table on the last good morning and called him a liar because he'd said he was thinking about nothing. He was thinking about her when he saw the smoke. It was thin, pale against the sky, rising from somewhere downstream. A chimney, maybe more than one. He stopped and watched it for a long moment, and the fear he expected didn't come. There was no dread, no urge to turn back, no voice telling him to stay in the woods where it was safe. There was just the smoke and the river and the weight in his chest that had loosened enough for him to breathe. He kept walking. The town appeared slowly. First a dock, then a cluster of cabins, real cabins, with boats pulled up on the shore and nets hanging to dry. Then a gravel road, and a general store with a gas pump out front, and houses with lights in the windows. It was small, smaller than he remembered, but he'd only been here twice, years ago, before his wife got sick. He'd always meant to come back. He'd never done it. A man was working on a boat near the dock, his hands black with grease, his face hidden under a cap. He looked up when Elias approached, and his eyes narrowed. "You're the fisherman," he said, "from upriver." Elias nodded. He didn't know how the man knew him, but it didn't matter. "Your boat came through this morning, drifting. We thought you'd gone in." "I almost did," Elias said. The man looked at him for a long moment. He was old, maybe 70, with a face that had been worn smooth by weather. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, and they moved over Elias's face like he was reading something written there. "You look different," the man said, "than I'd expect, for a man who almost drowned." Elias touched his pocket again. The fur was still there. The river was still there. The forest was behind him, and the wolves were somewhere in it. And he was standing at the edge of a town he'd never let himself see, because seeing it meant admitting he wanted something more than grief. "I had help," he said. The man nodded slowly, like he understood something Elias hadn't said. "You need a place to stay?" Elias looked at the town, the store, the houses, the smoke rising from the chimneys. Somewhere in one of those houses, there was a meal waiting to be eaten, a chair by a fire, a voice asking him where he'd been. Somewhere down the road, there was a life he hadn't let himself imagine, full of things he'd told himself he didn't want. "Yes," he said, "I think I do." The man wiped his hands on a rag and held one out. "Name's Harlan." Elias took his hand. It was warm, calloused, real. "Elias." "Welcome, Elias." Harlan looked past him, toward the forest, and for a moment his eyes held something that might have been recognition. You come at a good time. The run is starting. We could use another hand. Elias turned and looked back at the river. The water was gold now, the sun dropping toward the trees, and somewhere in the dark between the birches, he saw them. Three shapes, gray against the green, watching him from the edge of the forest. They didn't move. They didn't howl. They just watched, patient and still, the way they'd watched him since he crawled out of the water last night. He raised his hand. Not a wave, not a farewell, just a recognition, a thank you, a goodbye. The wolves turned and disappeared into the trees. 6 months later, Elias stood on the dock at dawn and watched the fog roll in off the water. It was thinner than the fog that had taken him that night, just a low mist hugging the surface, but it brought the same smell: wet wood, mud, the faint sweetness of decay. His hands were steady on the rail, his breath clouded in the cold air. Behind him, the town was waking up, lights coming on in the windows, the clatter of pans from the diner, a dog barking somewhere up the road. He'd been here since that morning. Harlan had given him a place to stay, a room above the store, and Elias had stayed. At first he told himself it was temporary, just until he figured out what to do next. But the days had stacked up, and the weeks had stacked on top of them, and somewhere along the way he'd stopped thinking about leaving. He worked on the boats now. Harlan had taught him the engines, the inboards and outboards, the two-strokes that needed just the right mix of fuel and patience. He was good at it, better than he'd been at fishing, maybe, because fixing things required a different kind of attention. You couldn't drift through a repair the way you could drift through a day on the water. You had to be present, to see what was broken and what was still sound, to know the difference between something that could be saved and something that had to be let go. He thought about that sometimes. The letting go. He'd gone back to his cabin once, a month after he'd walked into town. The boat was there, tied up at the dock, the oars still across the seats. He'd half expected to find the photograph warped, the watch ticking backward, but everything was as he'd left it 3 years ago. The photograph was on the mantel, his wife's face steady and real. The watch was still, the battery long dead. He'd stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the life he'd built for himself after she died, and then he'd taken the photograph and left everything else. The photograph was in his pocket now. He touched it sometimes, when the quiet got too heavy, when the town felt too loud and he needed something solid to hold on to. Her face was the same as it had always been, and when he looked at it, he didn't see the hospital anymore. He saw the morning light on the porch, her hand around a coffee cup, her eyes following the river the way his did now. The fog thickened as he watched. It rose off the water in long fingers, reaching toward the dock, and for a moment he thought he saw shapes in it. Gray shapes, low to the water, moving with the current. He blinked, and they were gone. He'd told Harlan about the wolves once. Not everything, just enough. The old man had listened without interrupting, and when Elias finished, he'd said, "You're not the first. Won't be the last." He hadn't asked for details. He'd just nodded and gone back to work, and Elias had understood that some things didn't need to be explained. The sun was coming up now, burning the fog off the water. The river turned gold, then blue, and the trees on the far bank sharpened into focus. A boat was coming upstream, a small aluminum skiff with a single figure at the tiller. Elias watched it approach, and as it passed the dock, the man in the boat raised his hand in greeting. Elias raised his hand back. He didn't know the man's name. He'd seen him before, maybe once or twice, but that didn't matter. They were on the river together, and that was enough. He turned away from the dock and walked up the gravel road toward the store. Harlan was already there, unlocking the door, his cap pulled low against the morning light. "Fog's burning off," the old man said. "It always does." Harlan nodded. "You going out today? The Johnson's been acting up. Could use your eyes on it." Elias looked back at the river. The fog was almost gone now, just a few patches clinging to the banks, and in one of them, he thought he saw something move. A shape, dark against the white, there and then gone. Yeah, he said. I'll take a look. He walked past the store to the shed where they kept the tools. His hands found the wrenches without thinking, the same way they'd found the oars once, the same way they'd found the branch in the dark water. But it wasn't the same. Nothing was the same. He was different now, lighter in some way he couldn't name, carrying something that felt less like a weight and more like a compass. The Johnson was tied up at the end of the dock, its motor tilted out of the water. Elias knelt beside it, his tools spread on the planks, and he worked with the sun on his back and the river moving past and the photograph in his pocket pressed against his chest. He was thinking about the night in the clearing when the wolf had touched him. Not the fear of it, not the strangeness, but the moment after, when he'd sat on the frozen ground with the stars above him and something loosening in his chest. He'd thought about that moment every day since, and every day it felt less like a memory and more like a promise. The fog was gone now. The river was clear, blue, and fast, and somewhere upstream, beyond the bend, beyond the marsh and the dead pine and the channel that led to nothing, the wolves were watching. He knew they were. He didn't need to see them. He tightened the last bolt and sat back on his heels. The motor was clean now, the fuel line clear, the spark plugs fresh. It would start on the first pull, and someone would take it out this afternoon, and they'd come back with fish or without, and it wouldn't matter because they'd been on the river. He pulled the photograph from his pocket and looked at it. His wife's face, steady and real. He touched her cheek with his thumb, the way he'd touched her face on the last good morning, when she'd called him a liar and he'd laughed because she was right. I'm still here, he said. The words were quiet, meant for no one. I'm still here. He put the photograph back in his pocket and stood up. The sun was high now, the day warming, and there was work to do. He gathered his tools and walked back toward the store, and behind him, the river ran on, the same as it always had, the same as it always would.